Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, one of the more fascinating week one matchups we have on the schedule, Georgia Clemson neutral site. You look at Georgia, they've been getting their flowers all offseason. They've been getting their flowers from the boys as well, at least in my mind, the number one team in the country heading into 2024. Dill, a team that I think is getting criminally disrespected this offseason is Dabo Swinney, the Clemson Tigers. Now, it is one of the easier programs to dunk on during the offseason because Dabo doesn't want to use the transfer portal. We look at this roster and say, at least on the defensive side of the football, it's going to be one of the best defenses that we see in the country. I think the big question, not only for this week one matchup, but for this Clemson team as a whole is, can this offense take that step heading into 2024? There are some reasons to think they take a step, right? Cade Klubnik going into year two as a starter. You have a much more talented and at least healthy pass catcher room than you had in 2023. And then Garrett Riley going into year two. Can Clemson put that on the field in 2024? That's the big question. We're going to find out a lot about this Clemson offense during week one against the Georgia defense. Fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and kind of getting nitty gritty into some of these matchups. That's some of the favorite stuff that we do. The amount of support you guys continue to show, it truly does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, the longtime listener, you guys know the drill. Let us know in the comment section how you guys are feeling, whether you agree with the boys, whether you disagree with the boys, whether you're calling us names in the comment section. We love it all. That's the beauty of college football. Drop your score predictions. Tell us what we have wrong. And Dill, without further ado, let's get into this one. You got to start with this Clemson offense against the Georgia defense that's going to be very good. I'll ask you the question here. How does Clemson just manufacture some explosive plays specifically in this passing attack against this Georgia defense?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, they just need their boundary wide receivers to play better football. And you've kind of seen that's been a big part of the stagnation of the Clemson offense.
Yeah.
Had those first, second round type players at the wide receiver spot. And I think you look at when teams can at least move the ball somewhat consistently against Georgia. It does have to do with having those wide receivers opening up the game a little bit. You saw Missouri with Luther Burden make a couple of big plays. And then on top of that, Missouri run the ball pretty good. You saw Isaiah Bond make a handful of big plays for Alabama in that conference title game. I think they need somebody to play good for them on the boundary, because if they get into like a bit of a phone booth battle with Georgia on defense, I just don't see what they're
you said it best. You look at how you just don't want to play Georgia. And what was our biggest critique of this Clemson offense last year was it seemed like everything was kind of inside of 10 yards. They just didn't have playmakers that made teams respect what they could do vertically down the field. And so you look at Clemson, the keys to this game is, can you get Adam Randall to reach some of that potential? You have two true freshmen in TJ Moore and Brian Wesco who are going to be day one impact guys for Clemson. Whether you're hitting explosive plays down the field against Georgia or just making them respect what you can do, allowing guys like Antonio Williams and Jake Bringenstool and Tyler Brown to operate underneath, that's by far the biggest question mark that you want to see from Clemson. On top of that, Georgia does have to replace a lot of talent in the secondary, right? Kamari Lassiter, Tyke Smith, Javon Bullard, all going to the NFL. You got some new faces. Don't take this the wrong way. This Georgia secondary is going to be very, very good. I think you have the best defensive back in the country in Malachi Starks, but can Clemson, maybe capitalize early on some new faces in the Georgia secondary? That's probably the biggest question mark that you have in this game. And
they might have the opportunity to do it, frankly, because Georgia wasn't like that same stifling group on the defensive line as they were last year. So teams did, if they could execute at a high level consistently enough, there was at least the opportunity to put a couple drives together and score some points. You saw that with the good teams they played. It just wasn't the same Georgia where it was like, oh, you can't throw the ball. You can't really do anything, because they were shutting it down on the defensive line. I think, again, Clemson's offensive line has almost been hit or miss, I feel like. Not a great game against Kentucky, played a really good game against Notre Dame. So you've seen moments where they've played good enough to, I think, allow Clemson to execute an offense. And frankly, I think that's one of the huge question marks for Georgia coming in, if they're going to get back to what they were, that machine that was rolling 2 years or for the past two seasons.
Yeah,
I think if that defensive line plays really well, that's where Georgia gets back to like
Hey, let's talk about that because again, you talk about Georgia and maybe the one aspect of this Georgia program that maybe took a step back in 2023. It was that dominant defensive line, and again, it was a very good defensive line. But you go back and compare that to the 2022 and the 2021 Georgia teams, it was a little bit different, right? There was no Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis that was just taking over games. That's the biggest story for Georgia. Like if this defensive line gets back to that kind of caliber, you're looking at the national championship team, at least in my mind. You take a look at some of the guys, Mikael Williams going into year 3. Can he emerge as that guy? I think we kind of expected him to come on year 2, and he was very good year 2, but can he be that game wrecker year 3? You have a guy in Jalen Walker coming off the edge that I think might be one of the best pure pass rushers that you see in the country. The matchup that I'm looking at is Georgia on the inside of the defensive line. I mean, you have guys like Jordan Hall or Jamal Jarrett or Christian Miller, all guys that have a ton of potential. Can they put it on the field in 2024? Because you look at Clemson and maybe their biggest question mark they have on the offensive line, it's at that center position. Can you take advantage of some of those matchups on the inside of Clemson's offensive line? At least in my mind, by far the biggest key for this Georgia defense against Clemson.
Because then if that happens, it'll be really hard for Clemson to just have opportunities to do something. And I think, again, Clemson's big question to me, can they just execute an offense? I feel like last year they left so much on the board, errant throws, fumbles, all sorts of really just plays that set you back. I think if Clemson has the opportunity to execute an offense and can, I think that's how they kind of stay in this game and be really competitive. But if Georgia's defensive line is playing like almost vintage Georgia defensive line, I that's where I think it gets a little shaky for Clemson and how they deal with that type of line.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. Like Clemson just didn't stay on schedule enough. And again, Cade Klubnik was a guy that you did not want in those third and long situations. You do not want to be in third and long situations against this Georgia program that starts turning up with some of those linebackers on the blitzes. Can Clemson stay on schedule? That's another massive storyline for that Clemson offense. Going to this Georgia offense versus Clemson defense, still two of the best units that we saw in the country last year. I don't think Clemson's defense got enough credit for how good they were because the offense consistently put them in bad situations. Let's take a look at this Georgia offense first. And I think one of the keys, at least in my mind, is Georgia hitting explosive plays in the passing attack. You look at what Kirby Smart did during the offseason, it was predicated on hitting some more explosive plays vertically downfield. We know Carson Beck has the arm, the talent to make those throws. Maybe one knock that you had is, did you have pass catchers that could work attacking that deeper third? Georgia goes out to the transfer portal and brings in a lot of guys who can do that, right? Colby Young, guy like London Humphreys. I think why I highlighted that as one of my key matchups is you look at this Clemson secondary, Dill, it's very, very good, but it's very, very young. Can you take advantage of some of that youth in this Clemson secondary? Because you go back to that bowl game against Kentucky that Clemson played, the secondary is very good, but they had some busts in coverage. They were a very young team. The communication wasn't necessarily there. Can Georgia maybe capitalize on that, push the ball down the field and hit some explosive plays? Because again, this Clemson front seven, in terms of methodically moving the football on them, that's going to be hard to do. So can Georgia manufacture some of those explosive plays? At least in my mind, the big key for this Georgia offense against Clemson.
I think you saw when teams had those guys to, like Kentucky had the Barian Browns and the Dane Keys, really explosive players who, if you did get some separation or did have a bit of a bust, you couldn't really account for that because they're too athletic. And I think that's kind of what you look for right now at Georgia is, do they have those guys? And I think you said it. They did try to make a concerted effort to change their ability to hit downfield and be a little bit more explosive with the transfer portal guys. I think, again, another thing that you kind of think about what Georgia needs to do, not only in this game, but going forward, that'll be a big thing. If you can see them in Carson Beck be comfortable with those new wide receivers and their ability to push the ball down the field, because he can attack that intermediate range. I don't think there's a quarterback in college football better. I think the next step is can they hit a couple of those big plays a game? And I think that makes Georgia a really hard offense to stop.
The intermediate range is something that I'm fascinated in this game because there's just not many defenses that have the personnel to deal with what Clemson can do at the tight end position. Even without Brock, I mean, there's going to be a lot of maybe outsiders from this Georgia program that assume the tight end position is going to take a massive step back. It certainly is not. I don't know if you have a Brock Bowers on this Georgia offense. You got some damn good tight ends, right? Oscar Delp going into year 3. You're bringing Benjamin Urasek, who I think is one of the transfer portal additions from Stanford that I think is just flying under the radar. I think that kid's an absolute stud. With all that being said, it's really hard to find defenses that have the personnel to deal with those kind of guys. Clemson has it, right? Barrett Carter, Wade Woodaz, those are some of the more athletic linebackers that you see in the country. They're both very, very good in coverage. That's going to be a fascinating matchup because that's normally where Georgia just picks defenses apart. Other defenses don't have linebackers to deal with those intermediate passing concepts. Clemson might, at least in my mind, if Clemson can take away some of those throws, that's Clemson's avenue to really get in this game on the defensive side of the football.
Because you even just blow that out a little bit, even a guy like Khalil Barnes in that nickel spot, their just ability, I think, to cover that middle of the field, that short intermediate range. Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think it's a little bit unique. I don't think a lot of teams can do it that way. And that's kind of where Georgia likes to attack. So again, I think the run game's just going to be two like mountains mashing into each other. I mean,
yeah.
Front seven for Clemson, offensive line for Georgia, running backs for Georgia, like those two units are as good as you'll see of any units in the country. So I almost like, what do you call that? Maybe a wash. I think for Georgia to be able to be consistent, I'm kind of with you. I think they need to be complete, and I think they need to show that ability to kind of hit those plays that they really didn't hit a ton last year.
Yeah, I think the last question mark, and again, this Georgia offensive line is going to be really good. This Clemson pass rush is going to be really, really good as well. I think specifically on the inside, I really do like some of the names that Clemson has on the inside of the defensive line. You look at Carson Beck, and a lot of the success he had was a lot of clean pockets, was able to step into a lot of his throws. Can Clemson be disruptive and take away some of those clean pockets? That's another key for Clemson. Dill, with all that being said, those are some of the keys to the game that the boys have. I'll give you the first pick. 13.5-point favorites to Georgia Bulldogs neutral site. Who you got?
I think I'd pick Clemson to cover that spread. I don't think they have a great chance of winning just because I'm not sure that I'm totally convinced this offense is going to be what it needs to be to go beat a Georgia team. And they can prove me wrong for all I know. But just what I've seen for the past handful of years, I have my questions. I just don't think, like, when does Clemson get blown out? And especially when they have good defenses and a good defensive line, I just don't see them getting trounced in this game, I don't think.
I agree with you. I do not like that 13.5-point spread because, again, Clemson is going to be very competitive. I'm going to go with Georgia. I'm kind of, and Clemson fans, I think, respect this. We've talked a lot about this Clemson offense. I need to see it before I believe it. And you look at Clemson's offense in 2023, I think it's going to be a lot better. Is it going to be a lot better week one against one of the best defenses that we see in the country? That's the question mark I have. I get 13.5 points is a lot. This Georgia offense can put up points. I mean, you look at last year, they averaged 39.5 points per game. That was number 5 in the country. They averaged 7.1 yards per play. That was number 4 in the country. I think Georgia will be able to find the plays to put the points up on the board. I'm not sure if Clemson can do that on the offensive side of the football. Now, if they do, this is going to be a very, very good game. If Clemson does take that step on offense, I'm not ready to take it until I see it from Clemson. I still think Clemson makes the college football playoffs, even if they do lose this game. They'll give me Georgia to cover 13.5. Don't feel great about it. We'll talk about this game from a lot of different angles over the next couple of weeks and months. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.